Senator from Indiana.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the call of the quorum be vacated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I was puzzled earlier today when the Majority Leader came to the floor to propose a unanimous consent request that we move forward with this continuing resolution. He's right, we should move forward with this. But I was puzzled by the fact that he said we've been standing around here now looking at each other and we're not doing anything. Well, we haven't done anything for the past 36 hours while we're trying to figure out who has the right to offer an amendment and whether that amendment will be agreed to in part of this unanimous consent request, limiting the time. The problem here is that, we came to the Senate believing that each senator had the right to offer any amendment. That's what we're here for, to debate that amendment and then take a vote on that amendment. The winners pass the amendment and we move on. So it's not a question of I won't offer my amendment unless I pass it. Let's debate it, see how each of us votes, and then go forward. But the Majority Leader essentially has simply said he will decide how many amendments will be offered and which amendments won't be offered, denying senators the opportunity to bring their amendment to the floor. And so there was an objection to his request to move forward because senators had been denied that opportunity. That's really not what the Senate's all about. That's not what people elected us to do. We've been in an empty chamber here, basically talking to no one, or at best to each other, and not moving forward with funding this government for the next 6 months in this fiscal year. Not a small matter. So we're all ready to go forward, but we would like to have the right, particularly as a minority, to offer our amendments to this resolution which provides for this funding. Now, I don't know how I'm going to vote on all these because some of them, I'm not even sure what would be brought forward. But we're here to evaluate those, to make our best judgment, to vote our yay and nay, or nay, to be able to explain to the people back home why we voted that way. And then they get to decide whether they want to send us back for another term or whether they think we did the right thing. Apparently, the Majority Leader has some problems with some of these proposed amendments. Maybe he doesn't want his members to have to vote on it because it's a tough vote politically. Well, what are we here for? We're not here for just to find consensus on everything that goes forward. We have different points of view, and it's understood that we won't always have consent to pass everything that's brought forward. And we ought to be debating that. There's different visions here about how we ought to go forward. But the solution to the problem of moving forward and getting this spending bill in place, which we obviously have to do, is to simply give members the opportunity to propose their amendments, vote on them, debate, vote, and move on. So over these last 36 hours, how many of these amendments could we have been debating and voting on? We probably could have cleared out all the amendments that were proposed by various members easily in half at that time or much less. And that's why we're here. We're in a divided government, so there's going to be two sides to each issue. But this standing around and then deciding, having one person, the Majority Leader, decide whether or not he will subject his members to a vote because he thinks that might put them in a difficult political situation, it works both ways. His side can offer their amendments. We can offer our amendments. Hopefully, we're offering amendments for the good of the country and not some for political gain or gotcha amendments. But nevertheless, that is the right of a senator to offer whatever amendment he or she deems best in his own estimation or her own estimation. Now, we're sitting here facing a serious debt crisis. Some have said this debt crisis isn't here yet, so we have more time to deal with it. I reject that fact. I reject that because if $16.7 trillion of debt isn't a crisis, I don't know what is. And at the rate that we're going here in Washington, we don't have more time to waste. But don't take my word for this. Just last week, at a hearing in the Joint Economic Committee on the debt crisis, we found widespread agreement from the witnesses across the ideological spectrum on a variety of issues, including the vital importance of dealing with our long-term debt issue and dealing with it now in a timely fashion. Reforming health and retirement security programs to rein in spending and preserve much-needed benefits. Let me relate some of that testimony. Former Senator and former Senate Chairman of the Budget Committee, Judd Gregg, who now serves as the co-chair of the campaign to fix the debt, stated this: "On our current path, this nation goes bankrupt." Now that statement was, a similar statement was made by Judd Gregg, a Republican, by a Democrat, Erskine Bowles, who headed up the president's own fiscal commission. And former Governor Bowles and Chief of Staff to former President Clinton said this is the most predictable financial crisis in the history of the country that's looming. And this was several years ago. And nothing's gotten better since then. We just careened closer and closer to that tipping point. So Senator Gregg says on our current path, this nation goes bankrupt. He noted that mandatory spender is the primary driver of the debt. And I quote again, "Unfortunately, all of the measures put in place have ignored smart entitlement reforms to control spending over the long term and comprehensive tax reforms to make the tax code more efficient." We've all heard that before from people all across the political spectrum, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. There is a growing consensus that these elements must be addressed if we are to address our long-term debt problem. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, former director of the Congressional Budget Office, noted that, and I quote, "The level and projected growth of federal debt is a drag on the current U.S. economic growth and a threat to future prosperity. The nation," he said, "despite claims to the contrary, remains on a damaging debt pathway." Dr. Holtz-Eakin countered arguments that reducing the debt is not urgent because the crisis is a distant threat by pointing out that, and I quote again, pointing out the U.S. is already paying an economic price for the excessive federal debt in terms of slow job creation and growth. He went on to say the obvious conclusion is that additional deficit reduction is needed to avoid debt-driven economic stagnation. And he called for a strategy that shifts the focus of spending control to the needed entitlement reforms and shifts the debate on taxes away from harmful higher marginal tax rates in favor of pro-growth tax reform. Alice Rivlin, the first director of the Congressional Budget Office and co-chair of the Debt Reduction Task Force for the Bipartisan Policy Center, as well as a number of other distinguished positions that she's held, as well as also being a former resident of my home state, Indiana, she insisted on the importance of a long-term budget plan that will halt the projected rise in debt. She said, "The prospect of debt growing faster than the economy for the foreseeable future reduces consumer and investor confidence, raises a serious threat of high future interest rates and unmanageable federal debt service, and reduces likely American prosperity and world influence." She stressed in her testimony the urgent need to act now to get the federal debt under control before events overtake us. A sense of urgency was unmistakably present during this hearing, and we read about it in the paper every day. We read it from columnists. We hear it on the radio and the television. We hear it on the talk shows. Why can't you get together and get this thing solved and resolved so we can move forward? You're holding down the growth of the economy. You're keeping people out of work. We're a stagnant growth, half of our historical average, coming out of a recession. And we all know that a significant percent of the money that we spend here has to be borrowed. It's borrowed from China, Saudi Arabia, from foreign entities. That is no way to sustain and maintain a healthy fiscal situation in this country. Our final witness at the hearing, Simon Johnson, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, called for significantly more long-term debt reduction than has been contemplated in many of the proposals thus far. Let me repeat that. Simon Johnson, not known as necessarily a right-wing or conservative economist, said that more long-term debt reduction than has been contemplated in many of the proposals so far need to be looked at, suggesting that the U.S. should aim at a national debt in the range of 40 to 50% of GDP rather than our current 90 to 100. And when discussing how much time we have to act, Dr. Johnson said, "We have no idea, but we need to start now." Well, we absolutely should start now. We should be spending each day here working on long-term debt reduction plan, because unlike the haphazard, rushed legislation we have seen over the past few years, a real, credible, long-term fiscal plan cannot happen overnight. It requires bold spending reforms. It must include a way to restructure programs like Medicare and Social Security so that we can prevent them from going bankrupt and preserve benefits for current and future retirees. Let me state that again. Those of us who have stood up and taken the stand on dealing with these so-called political suicide issues, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, are saying that we need to do something now to prevent these programs from becoming insolvent or less solvent, to prevent benefits having to be reduced or massive tax increases on the next generation to be imposed in order to keep them solvent. We want to deal with that now so that we don't undermine these programs. Those who say we should not touch Medicare are simply saying, not being truthful with the current and former future beneficiaries of that program. And the same is for Social Security. They are simply saying, we don't want to take the tough decision now to address some of these problems and make sensible reforms. We'll be gone when this thing comes undone. But they're saying to people, we're going to turn our heads to the plight of future beneficiaries and even current beneficiaries of these programs by not doing anything. And so it's time we work together to find a solution to this. I think there also is a consensus that comprehensive tax reform is an area where we can find common ground, but is absolutely essential, as our witnesses all stated, essential to providing the growth element so that this country and this economy can begin to grow. Additional revenue will come in from a more prosperous nation and from a greater rate of growth. And that will help us reduce our deficit spending. It will help us move toward a balanced budget. And it will help us from continuing to plunge into more and more debt and more deficit. Comprehensive tax reform is the best way to reduce the debt, grow the economy, and make America more competitive. Grow the economy. Not grow more government, grow the economy. That is what makes us more competitive, puts more people back to work. That is what puts us on a path to American prosperity. Now, these things will not be easy. It will require time, and it will demand political will, and it will demand political courage. So let's get moving. Senate Majority Leader says, let's stop wasting time. I couldn't agree more. Mr. Majority Leader, allow members to offer their amendments. Your members, our members, ones we like, ones we don't like. We are sent here to make the tough choices, to make our yes or our no, and represent people back home. That's what the Senate is all about. So instead of standing here, speaking to an empty chamber, members wondering, letting the clock run so that these amendments can be closed out and never offered under this bill, we should be debating these. And in doing so, we can get to the point where we will have our final vote, and hopefully we will be funding the government going forward. It's called regular business, and that ought to be our focus. Growing this economy and strengthening it for future generations is the challenge before us. It's the challenge of our time. We need political will and courage, boldness to go forward, but it's absolutely essential for the future of this country. And I suggest that instead of standing around doing nothing, we begin to address these issues. Madam President, with that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.